I'm not in competition with Stuart or John Hulse for jokes, but here is my contribution. Right. A police officer pulled over a car because it was swerving quite viciously on a quiet road. The officer pulls over the car and realizes that it's a priest driving the car, looking particularly merry. He asks the priest, "Have you had anything to drink, sir?" The priest, quite clearly drunk, says, "Only water, officer." Looking down, the officer sees a whole bunch of wine bottles rolling around the floor. "Sir, there are wine bottles all over the floor of the car." The priest looks dumbfounded and says, "Oh, the Lord has done it again." So yes, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Now, I have a question for anybody under 30. Okay? So if you're under 30, I'd like you to answer me, which 2 books of the Bible do not mention the word God? Anybody know? I can see some people over 30 scratching their head. Pardon? Esther, yeah, great. Anybody know which the other one is? Pardon? No, it's actually the Song of Solomon. I want to focus on the book of Esther today. Back in November, as part of Prophetic Communities, I was sat with my partner and we had to give each other a prophetic word. And this person said, "I see you bringing something from Brazil back to Bradford." What this person didn't know was that only the day before I'd signed up to go on a mission trip to Brazil. I knew that God had got something for me in Brazil that he wanted me to bring back to Bradford. My story starts when I went to Brazil this year. I was chatting to somebody and they mentioned Mordecai, and I thought, I know who Mordecai is. He's mentioned in the book of Esther. But I couldn't remember every single detail of the story. I sat down and read the book of Esther from beginning to end. And God spoke to me about Mordecai. The book of Esther is a clear reminder that God never forgets his plans and purposes. And he is actively working even when we don't acknowledge him. What I realised in reading the book of Esther was that without Mordecai, there would have been no story about Esther, because Mordecai was key to Esther's story. The book of Esther is a true story about a brave young Jewish woman named Esther who became queen of Persia, which is modern-day Iran. She was chosen by King Xerxes because of her beauty, but he didn't know that she was Jewish. Now, at the same time, a man named Haman became one of the king's top officials. Haman hated the Jews, especially Esther's cousin Mordecai, because he refused to bow down to him. Haman made a plan to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. Now, when Mordecai found out, he told Esther. She was scared, but she knew she had to help. So she set 3 days of prayer and fasting for all the Jews in preparation. Even though going to the king without being asked could mean death, Esther bravely went to him and invited him, the king, and Haman to a banquet. And at the second banquet, Esther told the king that she was Jewish and that Haman was trying to kill her people. So the king was shocked and angry. He stopped Haman's evil plan and had him punished. The Jews were saved, and Mordecai was given a high position in the kingdom. And to celebrate, the Jewish people started a holiday called Purim, which they still celebrate today. So that's a brief overview of the story of Esther. So this is what I would like you to do. This is going to be very interactive. So in Esther chapter 2, it tells us about Mordecai and Esther, and I would like you to get into groups and answer the following question. What was important about the relationship between Mordecai and Esther? So if you can get into, say, 3 groups and discuss what was important about the relationship between Mordecai and Esther, and if you start at Esther chapter 2, verse 5, and read through to verse 20.
But she treated Mordecai like a father.
So a
figure, yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
She clearly respected him and did things that he asked her to do and listened to what he was saying. But he was also very concerned and visited her every day. That's clearly quite important.
Great. Thank you.
I mean, we more or less said the same, that she clearly respected him and he clearly cared for her because he was checking in on her every day. So it's like a very close father-daughter kind of relationship.
Oh, we just got what you guys have said as well, and just that they were sharing a huge secret between them. Can I say anything?
Yeah, we discussed. It wasn't just the secret. But Esther was in the army for 12 months, and Mordecai was waiting outside, and he was inquiring about Esther. Esther kept her nationality secret. Everybody knew that Mordecai was a Jew, but nobody knew about Esther. So it's keeping that secret. Because Mordecai brought her up as his own daughter, the bond, the closeness of that bond that they have between them, God might not be mentioned in the book of Esther, but it's shown how God's love through Mordecai showed through Esther.
Yeah. Great. So, yes, I think that they had this secret, but the understanding is that they were Jews. They'd been taken into captivity, so we were living in a foreign land. So this is what I felt God say to me when I was meditating on this passage. Mordecai's job was to prepare Queen Esther for her hour of influence before the king. That was when she had to tell the king about the plans that Haman had made against the Jews. And he chose to adopt Esther because her parents had died and she was an orphan. And as you said, raised her as his own daughter. Now, at one point, the king of the country wanted a new wife to replace Queen Vashti because Queen Vashti had dishonoured him. So that's why Esther was taken into the king's palace along with many other young women to be prepared to meet the king. And as you've identified, the preparation involved 12 months of beauty treatments before they could be presented to the king. And so Mordecai showed his fatherly concern and would regularly go to the palace to inquire how she was doing. Her intervention would not have succeeded unless she'd first cooperated with Mordecai. Mordecai made sacrifices to promote Esther. And he wanted her to go further than he had. So what's the lesson for us? There are mothers and fathers here whose role it is to mother and father Esthers in their lives. In this fatherless generation, there are many Esthers, both men and women, younger and older, who are waiting to have spiritual mothers and fathers. And it's not just about having one spiritual mother or father, but it's having more than one spiritual mother and father, because each mother and father is unique and will have their own giftings and insights and anointings. I can remember when I was younger, I was calling out to God for a spiritual mother or father. But what I discovered at that time was that people in the setting I was in, people didn't know how to be spiritual mothers and fathers. They had no vision for it. Nobody to encourage them to step up the mark and to look out for the Esthers. What I've come to realise is that the Esthers and the Mordecais, it's a co-created relationship. The Esthers have to want to be fathered and mothered, want to be discipled, have the humility to learn and be teachable, and the Mordecais need to recognise their calling as spiritual mothers and fathers and be willing to be role models and influencers. So Mordecais and Esthers need to cooperate together. What it is to be loved by a father and mother, Mordecai was focused on serving God and serving others. He lived by example the life that he wanted Esther to emulate. So God is calling us to live in a manner that those in our realm of influence can easily observe and follow. If there had been no Mordecai, there would have been no Esther, and then all the Jews in the empire would have been annihilated. So this is my challenge to you. Now is the time for the modern day Mordecais to rise up and for the modern day Esthers to be prepared. So the next question I want you to think about is, what was significant about Mordecai sitting at the king's gate? So if you get back into your groups, it's Esther chapter 2, verses 21 and 22. The significance about Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Okay, if you can begin to finish up on your discussions. And if we take feedback from Les's group first, please.
Well, the first thing we noted was that Mordecai was regularly there. It seemed it was his practice to be there. And probably because it was his practice to be there, he would have seen these two guys on a regular basis. They felt comfortable talking in front of him. But Viv found something in the notes which was interesting.
Suggested that the king had replaced them with Mordecai, whom they considered a barbarian.
And it just says here that the gate, it was a civil place, a commercial and legal centre, so many people had been round there anyway, so it wouldn't have been unusual for him to be by the gate on a regular basis.
Really?
Mordecai told Esther, who is now Queen Esther, and she reported it to the king, but she credited it to Mordecai. So she was, the way I see it, she was returning favour, to Mordecai, who was in exile, which would also hopefully put him in good stead with the king.
You've got some great points there.
One thing that we were discussing was that when his story was believed, which makes you wonder, like, had he not gone through Esther, would he not necessarily have been believed? Just one point. Anybody else?
We spoke a lot about the integrity from both Mordecai and Esther, that they both chose the path of integrity and honor, because obviously the king is not a fan of who they are because of their race, but Mordecai still chooses, he could have just let him be killed, and vice versa. Esther could have taken the credit when she was passed. So they're both being very integrous, and that their rise is because of their integrity and humility.
Great point.
You can be at the right place at the right time, but it's also understanding, like you said, even though God wasn't mentioned in this book, that when you're aware of God's plan and how Mordecai saw the salvation, as it were, for the Jews, he recognized that the king was pivotal in that saving of his people. Yeah, you can be at the right place at the right time when you are recognizing God at work.
Yeah. Excellent. Right place at the right time. If you said when Mordecai was sat at the king's gate, he picked up on the conspiracy to assassinate the king, and then he shared the plan with Esther, who in turn shared it with the king. So not only was the king's life saved, as you said, as a result, that incident became involved and woven into the unfolding of God's purposes and plans for the people of Israel. So what is significant about gates, and Paul, you picked up on that. In Bible times, gates were seen as centres of social, legal, business and spiritual life, and symbolically, gates also represent access to God, divine judgment, and spiritual truths. They're also seen as places of worship and divine encounter. So God spoke to me about an invitation for us to be prophetic watchmen, stationing ourselves by the King's Gate in worship. Actually, it talks about spiritual watchmen having spiritual discernment, being involved in intercession and prayer, and because they're listening to Father God's heart, they offer divine strategies and insights to people. So that's about the prophetic. So I believe there are people here that God is calling you. You might already be operating as prophetic watchmen. You've stationed yourselves on the wall. You might be interceding for one person. God might be positioning you in strategic places of influence, the 7 mountains of influence, which I'll pick up later. Some of you may be positioned in more obscure places, but your role is no less important. And I came across this recently. Perhaps some of you have never even thought of Mordecai as being a type of prophet. Chris was teaching this week that characteristics of false prophets are that they attract people to themselves, not to Jesus. However, we see that Mordecai used his favour to promote Esther, not self-promotion. So the third thing that God highlighted to me about the story of Esther was in Esther chapter 4, verses 13 to 14. And probably these are the most well-known verses in the book of Esther. And it says, "Do not think that because you're in the king's house, This is Mordecai speaking to Esther now. Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape if you remain silent at this time. Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And then if you turn to 1 Peter 2 verse 9, it's that familiar verse that says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him." So Peter calls us a royal priesthood. So that means we are royalty too. So God spoke to me about the importance of speaking up, just as Mordecai charged Esther with speaking up, saying that she was in a royal position to speak up. We are in a position of speaking up. And I think that's relevant to some of us because sometimes it's easier to stay quiet. For Esther, she realised that to speak up, she was literally putting her life on the line. So she dared to speak out. We might not find ourselves in a life or death situation, but we are God's messengers. And we carry God's message in our heart. God is calling us to disciple nations. So what does that look like to you? My view is that it doesn't involve reposting negative judgments or critical comments on social media, but who is God calling us to speak to for such a time as this? You may be familiar with the idea of the 7 mountains of influence. It's about 7 key areas of society that shape culture and influence people's values and beliefs. These mountains are religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment as one mountain, and business. By influencing these areas, we can bring about positive change and ultimately usher in the kingdom of God on earth. So many a time we underestimate the power of our words, but actually a word sown in due season can be life-changing for somebody. May enable them to have an encounter with Jesus, receive healing, experience a miracle. A few months ago, I was tasked with giving a prophetic word to someone in local government. I protested to God saying, "But I don't know anybody in local government. What would I have to say?" But God had heard me, and that week I attended a meeting for charity leaders. And the guest speaker was from somebody from local government. I felt challenged to speak up, and I asked God for a prophetic word for this person. She finished speaking and people were crowding around her to talk to her, and it would have been easy for me to talk myself out of giving this word. However, I stayed behind and I managed to catch her before she left. I gave her the word. She thanked me, said, "Oh, that's very interesting." Anyway, this week I got to meet the lady again in a meeting, and she looked at me and she said, I've been invited to sit on a United Nations panel for sustainability. And I thought, that's the word that God wanted me to sow in her life, and she's seeing the fruit of that. But we can speak up in our everyday life, can't we? By sharing our testimony, speaking out words of encouragement, praying for healing for somebody, giving somebody a prophetic word, sending a text, telling someone about Celebrate School of Supernatural Ministry. So how many of us have been encouraged or experienced life-changing moments because someone took the time to speak to us? So let's do this for other people. So today, God is calling out Esthers. So that can be men or women, where you know there's a calling on your life to be an influence. God is calling out today Mordecais, spiritual mums and dads. Who are the Esthers in your life? Esthers, who are your Mordecais? God is calling out today prophetic watchmen who will sit at the King's gate in worship to hear Father God's heart, to intercede and pray. Viv was telling me this morning, I was asking how her son was doing, and she was talking about he has ups and downs, but she said, when he's struggling, I go into my room and I pray and worship, and that changes the atmosphere. And when I come out, there's peace. And speaking out, if you know there are words on your heart and you struggle with speaking out, you're lacking confidence, you're fearing what will man say, what will people think of me, then what I'd like you to do is in your groups, hopefully all of you will have identified with one of those things, will you pray with one another? Pray for people to be released into their destinies.